The Chofetz Chaim cites a midrash in Rus. The midrash tells us, Reb Zira says, Migiluzu ebo lo tuma v'lo taro. The story, the narrative of Rus, how she had come back with her mother-in-law from the plains of Moab, and how she converted to be a Jewess, and how Boaz had shown his kindness to her by allowing her to gather the various gleanings of the field, and ultimately married her. And she was the grandmother of David HaMelech, of King David. So this Megillah, the narrative, it doesn't contaminate one's hands. It has no law. It doesn't speak about what's forbidden, what's permitted. It's just a narrative. What's the value of that narrative? The value of narratives to tell us that look at the unlimited reward of a person who does chesed with another individual, that he merited that David Melch should be his descendant. King David should be his descendant because of the chesed which he had offered Rus, the Moabite, the convert. And ultimately, the Davidic line is David's. The royalty of the Jewish people is in David's line. Then it continues. We find that in the merit of Chesed, the rains come in the proper times. In addition, even if it was decreed in heaven that a person should die, once Chesed, one who engages in Chesed, this could actually annul the decree that the person should continue living. Now, this is very interesting. What about to be protected from the evil inclination? We all know that we're continuously challenged. What's the challenge? The challenge is always what we call the Yetzer Hara. Now, the Yetzer Hara plays on two fronts. It's on a mental front, intellectually. We have questions. We get confused. And also physically, because we are inclined physically to the material. So therefore, in the physical sense, since we're conditioned to be more involved in the physical, you have to go against the grain. You have to fight. You have to suppress those drives, the physical drives. So the physical drives are what? They drive you to do things which are not in conformance with the Torah, with spirituality. Whatever those drives may be, whether it's eating, whether it's a sexual drive, whether it's you want to do as you want to do, or you see things as you believe they should be. And heretical thoughts come to mind. So the Talmud tells us that fortunate are the Jewish people that when they get engaged in Torah and Gemilas Chasodim, Torah and acts of loving kindness, they have control over their evil inclination. And the evil inclination is under their control, and they're not under control of evil inclination. So he goes to explain something interesting. When a person studies Torah, what is the process? That the intellectual faculty, which is the brain, becomes engaged in spiritual concepts. So you're spiritualizing the mind. When you spiritualize the mind, all the reasons that allow you not to have clarity immediately are dispelled. Because the Torah is the cleansing lens, gives you that clear lens, that clear understanding of perspective. This is Barasi Yitzer, Barasi Torah Tavlin. I've created the evil inclination, and the Torah is the antidote. Shlomo tells us in Mishlei, Ner Mitzvah Torah Or. The Torah is the illuminator. Now, it's interesting. We always say that if a person would only understand and fully appreciate how wrong something would be, you wouldn't do the wrong thing. Except we don't. We don't appreciate why it's so wrong. I'll give you an example. Person's a diabetic, and he's only permitted to have so many carbohydrates. But when he sees certain kinds of foods, he craves for the foods. And when he starts craving very often, he allows himself to indulge, and ultimately he regrets it. And when he regrets it, he realizes he did the wrong thing. And he's crossed that line many times. See, if you cross the line many times, I want you to learn from your mistakes. But we don't learn from our mistakes. We keep crossing the line. Why? Because even as much as he knows and understands, health-wise, it's not in his best interest. But when you crave, you're drawn after that. So now, how do you somehow control that craving? Craving is a reality. The body craves. So the intellectual understanding of the consequence allows you to suppress that craving. You still crave, but you have to suppress it. It's not you lose interest. Losing interest is another level of understanding. We all crave. We crave material. Material is almost synonymous with things which are not in conformance with spirituality. Our physicality. Our minds are geared to what? A subject to ego. We want acknowledgement. What does the world acknowledge? What does the world value? World values material success. The world values concepts and values which are not in sync with the Torah. So how do you take the mind? So what do? You have to keep suppressing it. The Chofetz Chaim writes that even if you study the laws of Lashon Hara very well, and you understand what levels of transgressions you're in violation of, 17 negative commandments, 14 positive commandments, and you review it from today forever. It's inevitable you're going to fail. Why is it inevitable you're going to fail? Because you always have to control yourself. Not to cross lines, that's called control. But he says if a person would have Ahavas Yisrael, you truly would love your fellow Jew, you don't have to suppress the need to speak negatively about another person, because if you love him, you see the person positively, so it's not a suppression issue. You have no interest in speaking negatively about the other person. Very, very important point. Larry, do you hear it? If I don't like a person, or I see a person through a critical lens, naturally I want to say something negative. But if you love that person, we all know nobody's perfect, but that imperfection doesn't cause you to want to speak negative about him because you love him. So the way to deal with Lashon Hara, the main way to deal with it is to love your fellow as you love yourself. Then, of course, you have to know the laws, because you may think something's permitted. It's not permitted. But once you see your fellow no less than you see yourself as yourself, you don't want anybody to speak negative about you, because there's nobody who loves anybody more than he loves himself. So if you love your fellow as you love yourself, you have no reason or want to speak negative about that person. So what is it? It's not a control issue any longer. I have no need. A person who has clarity and understands what sin is, and you're able to internalize it, you don't have to control it. I'll give you an example. Today's society, what was considered at one time taboo, unacceptable, a person would not consider it in a million years to cross certain lines, ever. So it's not a person that had to control himself not to do certain things, because society was so geared and so established that certain things are unacceptable. So it was never a consideration. You had clarity in your gut, you knew it's something which is unacceptable. Today's society, that all the values and all the fences have been literally torn down and evaporated. There's nothing which people see as unacceptable. Intellectually, we accept it as unacceptable. But in reality, people, because we're so exposed to these other values, which are not in sync with the past, people are attracted to these things. So now you have to control yourself. I'll give you an example. 50 years ago, if a person was of a certain station in life or part of society, he would never consider premarital sex, not be considered. If you heard somebody had crossed those lines, you would actually be taken aback. Person had, even if he was a single man. We're not talking about extramarital fields, God forbid. I'm not talking about that. We're talking about crossing certain lines. People didn't do that. It was unacceptable. You had to be of a certain ilk of society to do that. But a person who saw himself as an upright citizen of society, a man God-fearing, regardless of what religion it was, that area, so a person didn't have to control himself. It wasn't a control issue. Because the society was geared and saw it in a negative light. But if all that has come down, and people hear so much of it, and it's so rampant, and it's so accepted, and so embraced, and it's not seen as something wrong, now people have to control themselves, not to be drawn into that. You have to keep your distance, because if you get too close, God forbid, the temptation will overtake you, and you'll be drawn into that. It's a whole different reality. So we speak about the Torah itself, not to steal, not to murder. A person who's an upright person is not tempted to steal. It's not tempted. A person doesn't have to control himself to take something that's not rightfully his. The person lives with an ethical and lives with integrity. You don't take something that's not yours. You don't want to harm anybody. So it's not a question I have to suppress that. But that's when I'm dealing within the basic behavior patterns of a human being. We speak of the 7 Noahide laws. Not to blaspheme God, God forbid. Not to eat a limb off a living animal. Not to do idolatry. Not to commit incest. Not to commit adultery. There's certain things. But when you go into the higher levels of spirituality, we speak about the 248 positive commandments and the 365 negative commandments, which cover other areas. We understand they're wrong because God says they're wrong. But do we internalize? Do we appreciate why they're wrong? The only way you can appreciate why they're wrong is you have to have your mind spiritualized, and it have to be re-geared and reoriented. That takes on a spiritual persona, a spiritual sensitivity. So how do you do that? It's by spiritualizing the mind. How do you spiritualize the mind? If the mind itself is occupied with spiritual concepts, the study of the Torah, which is the ultimate level of spirituality, and therefore Talmud Torah can get kulam, one word of the Torah is the equivalent of 613 mitzvos. One word of the Torah. So if multiply, you have an infusion of that level of spirituality in your intellect, what does your intellect become oriented for? It becomes oriented for spirituality. So anything which is not spiritual, automatically you sense and you want to reject it. You're not drawn into it because that's not your orientation. You know, you have these years ago. You have these locations that have cults, and the cults, they're so brainwashed that they have this person who runs the cult. Whatever he says, the minds they're brainwashed that he says makes certain. He has a certain phraseology, or he has a certain persona. When they're touched by that, immediately they lose control over their choices. They're drawn into that. A person comes from outside and he sees this. What does he say? This doesn't make any sense. And these people have to be deprogrammed. The only way they're able to regain control of their lives, you need a person who's professional. They have to be deprogram these people. And only professionals could deprogram them. You can't deal with them on a rational level to convince them that what they're doing is unacceptable and it's harmful to them. Why? Because the brain is geared. The way they process information is processed within the context of the cult. It's like mind games. So the only way you're able to deal with the evil inclination, he also plays mind games with us. He was created to play mind games with us, to create confusion, to take the negative and present it as the positive, and the positive as the negative. So by spiritualizing the brain through the study of Torah, now the mind has clarity, but the body itself is conditioned in the physical. So how do you recondition the body that it should be geared to spirituality? You know how you do that? By engaging in acts of chesed. Chesed is your physical body's involved. I give charity. I help people. I advise people. I give them my time that other people should be beneficiaries of what I have to offer them. Because that is a mitzvah that spiritualizes our physicality. Once your physicality is spiritualized, so your mind is spiritualized through the study of Torah. Your body is spiritualized by being engaged in acts of loving kindness. So therefore, the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, a person who engages in Torah study and Gemil Chasodim, acts of loving kindness, the evil inclination is not controlling that person. He controls the evil inclination. Because now he has a sense. It's no longer I do because I believe. I do because not only I believe, I have a sense of what I believe. And when you have a sense of what you believe, you're in a much more secure position than if you only believe and you don't have the sense, because then you're always in a suppression mode. And because you have temptation and you can't be cognizant every moment, you're vulnerable to fail. And it's probable you'll fail for that reason. So that's what the Gemara tells us. Fortunate Jewish people, that we have the opportunity, if a person engages in Torah study and Gemil Sasodim, acts of loving kindness, the evil inclination is under the control of the person. The person is no longer under the control of the evil inclination. Now, I want to make it clear. The Chafetz Chaim made it clear many times. Gemilas Chesed doesn't mean, you put $1 in the charity box. And once in a while, you help an old lady across the street. Or even do it every day. A person who's a Gomel Chesed means a person, his life is dedicated naturally. It's not a conscious decision. You're always looking for opportunities to help other people. It's interesting. Certain people, they're always involved. It's unbelievable what they do for other people. And other people, they say, it never crosses our desk. Never comes. We get a letter in the mail once in a while to give charity. So we make it yes or no. Either goes into the wastebasket or I write the check. Other people, they're always engaged in some level of helping others, whether it's financial, whether it's on an advisory board, whether it's helping people find positions, whether it's being a role model for others, whatever it is. But the mindset is always, what can I do for others? To lead them on the right path. That's Gemilas Chesed. That's your body. You're involved in the process. There's a famous word from the Chinuch. There's a law, on Pesach, there's a mitzvah to eat the Paschal lamb. When we have the temple on the 15th night of Nisan, every man, woman has to engage in eating of the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb. Why? Because the Jews, before we left Egypt, on the 15th night, before we left Egypt in the 15th of the morning, we ate the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb. The Torah says, but when you eat the Paschal lamb, you're not permitted to break the bone to extract the marrow from the bone, even though marrow is meat, but you're not permitted, the meat on the bone, that's the mitzvah to eat the meat. But to break the bone, to extract the marrow from the bone, that you're not permitted. Why? So he explains, the Chinuch, it was a codifier, gives rational reasons, philosophical reasons and rational reasons why the Torah prohibits certain things. He says, because what is the eating of the Paschal lamb? The lamb or the goat was the deity of Egypt. We slaughtered the goat, we slaughtered the lamb. We terminated that relationship. We're no longer involved in idolatry. We're free men. That's the reason why at the Seder, we eat, we recline. Reclining is an indication of a free man. It's the posture of a free man. Now, who breaks bones to suck out the marrow? A dog gnaws on bones. A free man doesn't have to suck out the marrow, eat the flesh on the bone. So he says, maybe you say, does it really make a difference? Because dogs gnaw on bones and you gnaw on bones. Does it really, is that so contrary to what a free man is? He says that question is only asked a person doesn't have the experience of life. He says there's a rule of thumb that we are products of our behavior. The way we behave, that's what we become. And he gives an example. A person is devoutly righteous, a tzaddik, and he's forced over an extended period of time to do acts of evil against his will. But if he's forced and he repeats that behavior long enough, he will become an evil person. And the person's evil. If he's forced to do acts of kindness and righteousness over an extended period of time, he will become a tzaddik. He'll become devoutly righteous. Why? Because we are all products of our behavior. The way we live our lives, that's what we become. That's what he explains. And therefore, he says, eating, breaking the bone and extracting the marrow, it has an effect. It minimizes our persona of being a free man, because that behavior is the behavior of a dog. That's what he says. So a person who does acts of kindness, what does that mean? A person not naturally is very protective of what he has. You're not giving. God says, no, a Jew has to be giving. It's one of the attributes, one of the internal innate qualities of Avraham Avinu. He was a Gomel Chasodim. He did for others. That means he was always involved in emulating this persona is God's persona. He's merciful, you should be merciful. He's gracious, you should be gracious. Going through that process of graciousness and mercy and acts of loving kindness, that behavior is a spiritual behavior pattern. That's spiritualization. When you spiritualize the physicality of the body, I'm engaged in chesed, what happens to you? The body itself becomes minimized regarding the physical realm. Now the realm which I'm involved in, my orientation is spirituality in the physical sense. So since my physicality is now oriented to spirituality, I no longer am attracted and drawn after physicality, which is contrary to spirituality. Therefore, the person who engages in Torah study, which spiritualizes the mind, and acts of loving kindness, which spiritualizes the body, because engaging in that creates an orientation, that person no longer has to worry about his evil inclination, because he is in control of his evil inclination. But you have to have that ongoing study process. The mind has to ongoingly have to be engaged in that process, studying Torah, spiritualization. It's like somebody once told me, his computer's not working because he didn't have it plugged in. So it has to have enough juice in it. Yeah, it has to be plugged in continuously if you want the computer to work on an optimum level. You need that infusion continuously. The mind has to be continuously infused with spiritual intellectualism, which is the Torah itself. As a result of that, the mind is very creative. The mind can justify anything. And what determines that? Conflict of interest. How do you overcome those conflicts of interest? How do you rise above fray? That's the study of Torah. And has the physicality of the person, which is naturally inclined to physicality. You spiritualize it. You give it a spiritual orientation. As a result of that, even the physicality is drawn after the spiritual, not after the physical. The Gemara tells us, based on a verse in Tehillim, David, when he would wake in the morning and he did his things, he was naturally drawn to the study hall to study Torah. His feet would take him there. He didn't even have to think about it. Naturally, he went there. It was like magnetic. His body was so conditioned to spirituality, he didn't have to think twice. He had nowhere else to go, no interest in anything else. He naturally was drawn there. Tell you an interesting story. He was a Rosh Hashiva. He was one of the Rosh Hashivas in Panovich. His name was Rav David Pavarsky. He was a Lithuanian Jew. He came to Israel right after the war, and he was a great Torah scholar. Great. Passed away, he was in his 90s. and he was older. He wasn't well. His wife passed away. He was a widower, and he lived right next to the Panovich Yeshiva. Panovich Yeshiva had maybe a 1,500 student body. It was one of the largest yeshivas in Israel years ago. And it was from his home to the study hall, to the Beis Medrash, was maybe 5-minute walk. And when he was older, in his 90s, he wasn't well, he had a yeshiva student who would actually room with him, sleep with him, that if he would have any need, take his medication, the system, when he would awaken, the student was there. So the doctors told the student, if the rabbi wants to leave the apartment, under no circumstance should you allow him to leave the apartment, because he's not well enough, and that level of exertion can actually cause him to end his life. So it's your response to make sure he doesn't leave the apartment, to go to the yeshiva. What happens? 3 o'clock in the morning comes. He's been doing it all his life. He's going to the Beis Medrash. He's going to study Torah. The student says to the rabbi, Rabbi, I think it's not a good idea. Just ignores him. Gets dressed. He's out the door. So when the morning came, early morning, he calls the doctor. He says, I can't keep him. You give me a task to be responsible for the rabbi. He doesn't listen. What am I supposed to do? You told me his life's in jeopardy if he goes to the Beis Medrash. The exertion, he says, I want to explain you something. I realize now, withholding him from going to the Beis Medrash and denying him the study of Torah will put his life in greater jeopardy than the physical exertion going to the Beis Medrash. Just let him go. You understand? Meaning he was so conditioned to study Torah, it's something he couldn't control himself. It's like a person has to quench his thirst because he hasn't drunk in weeks, and without it, he's parched. He'll become dehydrated to points of non-functional. That's the way he was. Torah was so embedded in his being. That was his orientation. He needed it for his existence. And if he'd be denied it, it actually could compromise his life, that he would die. That's what the doctor says. A Jew, if you orientate yourself in the physical sense, doing acts of Chesed, engage in Torah study, the mind, in combination, it's the best combination. The mind is spiritualized, but the physical is not. Many years ago, when I was a child, I watched TV. I'm going back, we used to have a 12-inch TV screen. It was called Philco, maybe 11-inch screen. The little TV. So they had a movie that this person was a no good person. And he was an alcoholic, a drug addict. He didn't have one decent experience in his life. And somehow they took a young person, vibrant, and they transferred his soul into this young person's body. So this man has a new lease on life. Could you imagine? You know what happened to that young person? He became corrupted because the moment he was infused with the soul and the persona and the personality of this other person, his whole physicality was geared to what? It was inclined to what? Identical behavior. Even worse, because now he has no energies. So now he's involved with a gusto. You understand? So the body normally is that. It's like breaking a bronco. A person goes and breaks horses. A bronco has tremendous energy. How do you break it? Once it's broken and it understands you control it, you're able now to gear its power. The rider can now gear its power and direct it where it should go. The body itself is an uncontrollable force. The only thing that could break it is through its spiritualization. Intellectual spiritualization, which is Torah, and the physical spiritualization is engaging in acts and loving kindness, and that will gear the body, give it an orientation. So if you have both, the combination of both, you will no longer be in the hands of the evil inclination, but the evil inclination will be under your control. This is the understanding. You read about the SEALs, the Navy SEALs, the level of training they have, it's beyond anybody's understanding. They're so in control of their bodies. Every movement their minds, and they're not ordinary intellectually, they have above average intelligence, these people. But the physical, the strength, and the control and the intensity of their training is not to be believed. They have to train continuously. The training is rigorous. The training is painful. Whatever they have to do, where they have to carry, where they go underwater, and they have to fight for their lives, and they could stay stationary like a stone for a week. And they could be actually incognito. You don't even know it's a human being there. You think it's a rock lying there in the field. It's a level of, but if they don't continue training, even for a short period of time, they lose that ability to function as a Navy SEAL. What is that all about? Everything's orientation. The way we're oriented, the way we live our lives, that's what we become. And the Torah gave us a prescription. Torah for our minds. Give us Chesed and do mitzvahs for our physicality. In combination, we've created a spiritual being, although we function in the physical sense, in terms of our physical needs. But our persona and our inclinations, our drives are spiritual, no longer physical, mundane drives.